but by golly, they don't delete. Let's make them delete. We can do it. So the delete button is right here in the DOM in our little template element that we're cloning. So we need to listen for something to happen to that button, but we need to wait until after we clone it before we start listening for that, because we need to listen to what's happening on the copy, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add another class to these. I'm going to just throw a class of delete on that one and a class of fave on that one just to target it. We could target it using warning or alert, but those are just the colors, so I kind of feel funny targeting them that way. I'd rather have a class on there that tells me what they do. So I'm just going to throw those on there in the HTML. So render list item clones the list item, removes template from the class list, sets the ID, grabs the flick name, the little span, and changes its text content. Now we also want it to start listening for clicks on that delete button. I'm going to do what I did here and just chain it on the end. Use the query selector to grab the thing, then add the event listener instead of saving it to a variable first. And as I did up here, I'm going to put it on multiple lines just to make it a little easier to read. So item, to find the button, I will look for query selector. And I'm going to look for something that has the class, what did I call it? Delete? I called it remove this morning, so I'll call it remove again, just for consistency. Dot remove and dot button. I want both classes to be on it. I want to make sure it's a button I'm grabbing. So that selector means that it has both classes on the same element. So after I grab it, I'm going to add an event listener to it. What kind of event am I listening for? A click. What do I want to do when that happens? I want to call a method that I haven't written yet. I'm going to call it this.removeFlick. Write for the function you want, not the function you have. So let's write it. Remove flick. Don't forget your comma. Always do it first thing, otherwise I do forget. And remove flick is an event handler, right? So we know an event is going to be passed in, whether we ask for it or not. So there it is. It's not a submit, so we don't need to prevent default or anything. It's just a button click. So what do we need to do? We need to remove the LI from the page, right? How do we find the LI? Well, what do we know? We know which button was clicked. Yeah, who said something? No, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's what render list item.
Okay, so render list item, it's this item right here. The thing that's stored in the variable item here? Okay. We could use that. We could find a way to use that. Yeah? Parent element's parent element. Whose parent element?
So is the button's parent element?
The button's parent element. And the button, how do we get the button?
Event.target.
Event.target, right. So event.target is the button, right? Because that's what was clicked. Looking at the HTML, the parent of this button is the span. The parent of that is the LI, which is what we want to remove. So we could definitely do that. That is, so let's get event.target. You don't necessarily need to copy this because I'm going to do it another way too. Event.target would be the button, right? .parent node will give you the parent element, its immediate container. .parent node on that should give us the LI. Now, if we ever change our markup a little bit, that's going to break. So it is a little more brittle than some ways we could do it, but it totally works. Let's confirm that it works. Let's say, let me inspect this delete button right here. You may remember from Friday or Thursday, when you highlight something with the inspector, it sets that element to $0. So $0 right now is the button. So $0.parent parent element or parent node. That gives me the span. Dot parent node dot parent node gives me the li. How do I remove it from the DOM? Dot remove. And it's gone. Totally works. Let me follow Amari's line of thinking here for a second. This is also not the final way I'm going to do it, but we have the item right here in this variable. Is there some way we could use that? From inside, remove flick. So we learned about bind the other day, and we learned you can change the value of this by using bind, and we learned you can pass in arguments using bind. So right now inside remove flick, what is this? It's going to be the button again, right? It's not going to be our containing object because it's an event handler. So if you said bind this here, then it would be. But we learned you can pass in additional arguments to bind, and it will pass those things in as arguments. So what if I passed in item? The item we just cloned. What if I pass that as an argument to remove flick? First of all, if you pass in more arguments to your event handler, where do they go? Do they go before or after event? They happen to go before. So event is always going to be the last argument that it passes into your event handlers. Anything that you pass by binding is going to go first. So if this is all true, we could just say item.remove like this. It works. So that probably uses the least code of any solution we could use. I like that. Another way, instead of using parent node, you could use closest. Closest, like query selector, takes a selector as an argument. But what it does, instead of looking at its descendants, like query selector does, right here inside item, we're looking for flick name. We use query selector on item. That means we're going to look at all of item's children and descendants for that selector until we find one. Closest looks at the element itself, and if that matches the selector, it's going to return that. Then it looks at its parent. If that doesn't match the selector, it looks at its grandparent on up the tree. So closest kind of does query selector in the opposite order. It looks at everything that contains the current element. So in this case, closest would look at the button itself. Say we put closest dot flick. Okay, that class isn't on there, so it's going to look at its parent, the span. Dot flick, not there. Look at its parent, flick is there. So we could use that. If you know it's going to be, if you know your button is inside that element, but you don't necessarily know that it's exactly 2 levels up, you could use closest. So that would look like this. Event.target.closest. Look for the class flick, and then remove that. Totally works. Or we could do it this fancy way. Which way you like better? Using bind or using closest? No, but don't care. This is kind of fancy. Let's do it. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there like a benefit besides like how much we're using to using each of these?
Not really. Certain DOM elements are kind of slow. So there is a slight advantage here that you don't have to go traversing the DOM. So you don't have to look at what the parent is. You don't have to look at the grandparents. You already have the dang list item. It's right there. You don't need to grab it from the page. So it is a little more performant. If there were lots of this, it might matter a little more. The other isn't horrible, but this is the more performant of the options. So let's do it. Yeah.
So that the function given to the add event listener is a callback function, right?
Right. Yep.
So when we are passing item
Mhm.
through that, why does the item still exist at that?
Why is it the right item? Because that's how bind works, basically.
Doesn't like the function like die after it finishes executing? And, like the callback would come say after 5 minutes or something. Like this function is finished.
You're saying like render list item, right? Render list item is no longer running. Its variables are out of scope now, right? That's true. But the way bind works, so bind will add this event, well, we'll add an event listener, and then we'll pass in some function. And what bind does is it actually returns a new function that is a copy of this function with these values bound to it. So when this happens, when this line runs, it's going to create a new, essentially anonymous function that is just like remove flick, except that those variables are there. And so whatever they were at that time, they're still going to live there inside that event listener, basically. So, yeah. Yeah, it stays there. Even though the containing function goes out of scope, that is the value that's going to get bound to it. Yeah, kind of interesting. So let's go ahead and commit this. This line's a little complex, so I'm going to go ahead and put some line breaks in there before it gets any worse. So remove items from the DOM, but not from the array yet, right? We're only doing the DOM.